All right, I'm back, and I'm going to, this won't be as long of a video clip on this, this section of Unit 1 where we're talking about the functions of your white blood cells or your leukocytes. And in this video clip, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, why do you make these different percentages or these different amounts of these different types of white blood cells that we have that have all these various jobs that we discussed in the last video clip. And then we'll also talk about a little bit about leukocyte disorders. So let me get my pen up here. You know, I'm getting faster at this pen thing. Well, now that I said that, it's not going to work. Let's see. All right, there we go. Okay, leukopoiesis. So you've already heard the term hematopoiesis, which is referring to white blood cell formation in general, but we're mainly going to be talking here about leukopoiesis. And in the last video clip, I showed you this diagram from your textbook, and no, I'm not going to go back through this again, but just as a reminder, all of your blood cells start off as or are derived from a type of stem cell in your bone marrow called a hemocytoblast. And depending on your needs, as these hemocytoblasts divide by mitosis and keep dividing, the descendants of those hemocytoblasts will go through processes of specialization where they will change in their shape and things that they're making and producing, their appearance will change. And they go through different stages over time. They keep dividing more and more and more, and the later descendants keep changing. And ultimately, if we're thinking about the white blood cells that you're producing, they're either going to become eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, monocytes, or lymphocytes. And your bone marrow produces these in different amounts depending upon your needs. And we've already seen the percentages of these different types of white blood cells that you have under normal circumstances. But let's say you have a bacterial infection. What white blood cell did we learn about is very good at rapidly swarming into a part of the body where you have an infection and phagocytosing bacteria? Those would be your neutrophils. Okay, so when you have a bacterial infection, your bone marrow will actually start producing more neutrophils because those are really good weapons against bacterial infections. Or let's say you have a tapeworm or a hookworm. Hopefully not, but suppose you did. We learned that eosinophils are very good at combating parasitic worms. So your bone marrow will start to produce more eosinophils. Okay, so depending upon your needs, what your body is experiencing, you may have to make different amounts of these various types of white blood cells that we're learning about. Well, how does your bone marrow know how to do that? We're not going to go into all of the details of how that happens, but basically there are chemical messengers. Most of these are special types of proteins that are produced by your bodies, and they function kind of like hormones of your immune system. So if you have an infection taking place somewhere in your body, the cells that are already present at that site where an infection is taking place will release certain chemical messengers depending on the needs, the requirements. Those will travel to the bone marrow. And when they arrive in the bone marrow, different chemical messengers will cause different amounts of these mature white blood cells to specialize and develop in the bone marrow depending upon your needs. These chemicals that help tell your bone marrow make more of this particular white blood cell versus another, they fall into two groups, interleukins and then colony stimulating factors, or CSFs. Both of these are involved in triggering the production of more of the various types of white blood cells that you need. Some will stimulate production of more neutrophils. Some will stimulate the production of more eosinophils. Some will trigger lymphocytes to divide so that you have more of those, depending on what your needs are. We're not going to go into the gory details of how all that happens. We'll talk a little bit more about some of that when we discuss the immune system, and you'll learn more about it in microbiology as well. Okay, now what about leukocyte disorders? We're not going to talk a whole lot about leukocyte disorders. We're mainly going to talk about leukemia, but some terms you should be familiar with. First of all, leukopenia. Whenever you see that suffix penia there, that's referring to you have too low of an amount of a particular cell type. So for leukopenia, that means you have too few white blood cells, too few leukocytes. There's another term, it's not here on this slide, but leukocytosis refers to elevated levels of white blood cells or leukocytes. You have too many or an abnormally high number. Leukocytosis may be triggered by something such as a viral infection. You're infected with a virus, you need more white blood cells to combat that infection. So you're going to have more white blood cells than you normally would have. So that would be something that would trigger leukocytosis. Leukopenia, why would you develop that? You notice drug-induced is listed here on the slides. If you're taking chemotherapeutic drugs because as treatments for cancer, those drugs not only kill cancer cells, they also tend to be very damaging to the normal cells of your bone marrow, because these cells in your bone marrow are rapidly dividing, much like cancer cells, so they're going to be susceptible to those types of drugs. So when you're on chemotherapy, you can develop leukopenia. Your white blood cells are too low. That makes it difficult for you to fight infections properly. Now, leukemias are cases where you have some kind of white blood cell cancer. Those are cancerous type conditions. And leukemia is developed, if we go back and look at this chart one more time, you'll see that here's what we're trying to make ultimately, your mature different types of white blood cells here. But you have different stages of maturity during this development process for these cells. Leukemias generally occur when immature type white blood cells, such as these myeloblasts, usually when you see blasts on the end of a cell name, that's referring to an immature, not completely specialized or not completely differentiated type of cell. If one of these types of cells becomes cancerous, which means it starts dividing out of control, it doesn't go on and finish its specialization. It just stops here, and you wind up with too many, an excessive amount of one or more of those types of immature white blood cells. That is a case of leukemia. There are many different types of leukemia. Now that you've studied about lymphocyte development, the next time you hear about leukemia, pay close attention to the name, because you may hear of a friend or an acquaintance who has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Okay? That means that person had a lymphoblast in his or her bone marrow that became cancerous, started dividing out of control. Those cells were not going on to specialize and become lymphocytes like they were supposed to, and they just wind up with huge, abnormally high numbers of lymphoblasts. Or you might hear of somebody who has chronic myeloblastic leukemia. That means you have an immature myeloblast type of white blood cell that in the bone marrow became cancerous and started dividing out of control. So there are numerous different types of leukemias, and they're named according to the cell type in the bone marrow that became cancerous. Yeah, you have your myelocytic or myeloblastic leukemias and your lymphocytic, or you can have lymphoblastic or lymphocytic leukemias, depending on the type of white blood cell that became cancerous, as I already mentioned. Acute versus chronic leukemias. Acute leukemias mean these cells are dividing very rapidly, growing to excessively high numbers very, very quickly. They tend to make you ill very quickly, and if untreated, most of them are going to be fatal pretty quickly. Chronic leukemias are more slow. Maybe the cells are not dividing as quickly as they do in the cases of acute leukemia. And yes, they may ultimately be fatal, but probably it's going to take a longer time for them to become fatal in general. Chronic leukemias are more prevalent in older people. Acute leukemias are more prominent in children and younger adolescents. Well, why are leukemias so devastating to people that have them? What happens is you think about your bone marrow, and when you study the skeletal system in Biology 201, you have a certain amount of space within your bone marrow that's occupied by that red bone marrow where blood cell formation takes place. If you have leukemia and you have some type of immature white blood cell that's multiplying out of control, those cells wind up dominating your bone marrow. They squeeze the other types of cells out. They squeeze the healthy ones out, including the red blood cells that are trying to form in your bone marrow. So because of this, you don't have adequate red blood cells. You don't have adequate platelets being formed in your in your bone marrow. You're not making appropriate amounts of the mature functional types of white blood cells that you need. So what happens? Ultimately, if you don't get treated, you're going to have internal hemorrhaging because you can't clot your blood properly. You're not going to make enough red blood cells, so you're going to have anemia. That's going to make it very difficult for you to get red blood cells transport oxygen to all of your tissues. You're not going to be able to oxygenate your tissues properly, so your major organs are going to fail. And also, if you're not producing proper amounts of the functional white blood cells that you need, you're going to die of infection. If your immune system stops functioning, you're going to die. No ands, ifs, or buts about that. This little diagram that I found online is trying to show you, if you could look microscopically at bone marrow tissue, normal bone marrow. So in here are all those little cells on the diagram that we were looking at. Your white blood cells in different stages of maturation. And then over here would be a representation of bone marrow from a patient with leukemia. And you can see it's really, really much more crowded with various types. Well, it should be one type of immature white blood cell that is multiplying in an out of control manner in the case of leukemia. Treatments for leukemia, there are radiation, various types of chemical drugs that are given to patients with leukemia. And in really severe cases, what they do is they go in and they use radiation and or drugs to completely kill all of your bone marrow, and then they do a stem cell transplant or a bone marrow transplant where you receive new bone marrow from a donor, and then those stem cells, those hemocytoblasts, if you have a good tissue match, they're able to regenerate from those cells dividing and specializing your red blood cells and your platelets and your white blood cells as you need them. Of course, that's a very drastic type of therapy to have to undergo. All right, so that's it for this lecture on leukocyte disorders. And again, we'll be revisiting these leukocytes again when we talk about the immune system. So I will be back with you on this topic a little bit more detail later in the unit.